Hey, Joe Brunsman here, back with another video for you. Today we're going to be talking about the new MSP registration law in Louisiana and why I think it's actually more dangerous than it would just naturally appear at the surface, and really why I think every MSP in the country should actually be following this type of law very, very closely. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump into the bill here. Act 117, Senate Bill number 273. Pretty much all these laws start off with an act, right? To enact, blah, blah, blah. And the purpose, and it's registration with the Secretary of State by managed service providers and managed security service providers servicing public bodies to provide requirements for doing business, to provide for definitions, to provide for exceptions to public records law, and to provide for time limitations on the reporting of cyber incidents, and to provide for related matters. So I've gone through, I changed the background here so I'm not blowing out your retinas if you're watching this at night. Really relevant parts are actually highlighted. All right, so moving further, essentially it says, hey, this shall not apply to cyber incidents or payments of cyber ransom submitted to the Louisiana Fusion Center and anything that deals with critical infrastructure. So one thing to actually know about Louisiana law is Louisiana is the only state, I believe, that actually uses something called civil law, whereas every other state here in the United States uses something called common law. So civil law there in Louisiana is actually built off of really Napoleonic code. So essentially some French, some Spanish, and I believe Roman law is essentially how that's put out. So it's a really strange legal system. So looking at the scope and the purpose here, it's to create a registration for MSPs and MSSPs doing business in this state with a public body. So it looks like it's only going to pertain, at least directly and initially, if you are an MSP or an MSSP doing work with a public body. And there's a whole list of definitions later. To provide access for public bodies to obtain information on managed service providers and MSSPs. What is that information going to be? It doesn't appear to say in this law. Is that going to be, hey, here's a public listing of all the security controls you have in place? That probably wouldn't be a good idea. Who knows how this is going to play out? And 3, to require MSPs and MSSPs to report cyber incidents and the payment of cyber ransom or ransomware. So cyber incident, importantly here, means unauthorized acquisition of and access to information maintained by a public body. So with just that alone, you'd say, okay, well, maybe ransomware wouldn't actually be encapsulated in this law. But then they also go on and they say cyber ransom or ransomware means, obviously you guys know that. The Louisiana Fusion Center means the Department of Public Safety and Corrections, Office of State Police, Louisiana State Analytical and Fusion Exchange. They go on to say what an MSP is. Hopefully you guys know that if you're watching this video. And then they go on to describe what an MSSP is. A managed security service, right? Obviously that's pretty straightforward. Network and system security service been outsourced to a third-party service provider pursuant to an agreement, blah, blah, blah. The term shall not include, and this is important, a cybersecurity consulting service or customer managed service purchased from the provider. Provider means an MSP or MSSP that requires remote management or operational control of a public body's network or end users. Public body means essentially what you would think, right? State, parish, municipal government, but it also includes public or quasi-public nonprofit corporation designated as an entity to perform a governmental or proprietary function. So, even if you're not an MSP that's, say, in Louisiana that is, doing work with some sort of government entity, maybe you could get kind of hamstrung there with the public or quasi-public nonprofit corporation. So if you're dealing in that world, I would definitely take a look and see if this could actually pertain to you. And of course, it says a provider shall not provide MSP or MSSP services to a public body unless the provider has registered with the Secretary of State and remains in good standing. What does it actually mean to remain in good standing? How are you not in good standing? How do you initially become in good standing? We don't know. In February 1st, 2021, each provider that manages a public body's information technology structure, security, or end user system in the state shall file an application for initial registration with the Secretary of State consisting of the provider's name, address, telephone number, blah, 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 blah. All right. But what's actually most interesting here is contact person and designation of a person in this state for service of process. So what is a service of process? Essentially, when you get processed, that means someone's like handing a lawsuit over to you in broad terms. So that's kind of an interesting little addition there inside of the law that really kind of hints to, nowhere else in this law does it really have anything about, any sort of fines or penalties that I've seen. So this looks like they're adding that potential inside of there. There could be some sort of fine or penalty or some sort of legal action potentially brought against an MSP. Not entirely sure. We shall see. All right, moving on. Registration is effective for 2 years unless the registration is denied or revoked. How is a registration denied or revoked? It doesn't say. 90 days prior to the expiration, a provider shall submit a renewal application, blah, blah, blah. All right. Notification of cyber incidents and payment of cyber ransoms. Also another kind of interesting provision here. To the extent that a provider has actual knowledge of a cyber incident which impacts a public body, the provider shall notify the Louisiana Fusion Center of the cyber incident within 24 hours of discovery of the incident. Now, I guess the real question here is, well, why wouldn't the public body just do that? Obviously, they all have cell phones, I would just presume. It kind of reminds me like when I was in the military and you'd have to fill out your application to renew your top secret security clearance. And they'd ask you, where have you been in the last 4 years? And you're like, wouldn't the United States government know that? Like, you've sent me to all these places. You sent me to all of these countries. You know exactly when I was there, when I left. Anyways, if a provider has a cyber incident which impacts a public body and the provider or public body makes a payment of cyber ransom or ransomware, to the extent the provider has actual knowledge of the payment, the provider shall report the payment of the cyber ransom or ransomware to the Fusion Center within 10 calendar days. So once again, wouldn't the public body actually know about this? Why is the state mandating that the MSP or the MSSP actually provide this knowledge? You'd think it would just be much simpler for the public body to make that sort of requirement, but such is the law. A public body shall include the requirements of this section in its contract with providers. So if you're working in that space, this is now going to be a contractual requirement that you are ostensibly in good standing, whatever that means, with the state of Louisiana before you can even be considered in a contract. It'll also be interesting to see if, potentially the law could kind of expand, really kind of beyond the four corners of this particular law. So for example, if one of your clients is doing work with a public body, would that client then just out of precaution require you to be in good public standing and register with the Secretary of State? I don't know. We'll have to see how that pans out. And then, of course, a public body shall not enter into a contract with a provider that is not registered with the Secretary of State or has failed to renew its registration with the Secretary of State. And we're almost done here. The Secretary of State shall also adopt rules and regulations to implement the provisions of this chapter. So what does that mean? It looks like, some of those questions I had before, it looks like, really kind of the governmental body here in Louisiana has punted the specifics of this law over to the Secretary of State. And it's going to be the Secretary of State that's actually going to promulgate the particular rules and regulations you're going to have to fall under. So that's kind of terrifying because, hey, this is becoming effective February 1st, 2021. And from here until then, if you're dealing in this arena or you want to deal in this arena, that could be a competitive advantage for you, I would presume, depending upon, really your particular business. But we don't actually know a lot about how this law is going to pan out. So let's talk about, the real questions behind this law, because reading the law itself, I mean, it's interesting. It's nice to know, but it's always kind of that subtext that's really personally more interesting to me. And I think really more pertinent for businesses out there. So the first question is the public even going to care about this? Now, I'm not talking about a public body, but just the public at large. So will the public have access to this database? Is that going to be some sort of competitive advantage that an MSP or an MSSP could use in this particular state or even around the country? We're not really sure. Next, how do you actually begin in good standing? What is good standing? How do you demonstrate good standing? Right? Is it going to be something where you have to meet certain criteria to be in good standing? Is it going to depend upon, what type of MSP or MSSP you are, what type of clients you're holding? Is there going to be some sort of certification process to actually demonstrate you're in good standing? We don't know. What happens if you aren't in good standing? We talked about how they're going to want your address for process. So how do you get in bad standing, as it were? What if that breach legitimately is just not your fault? Does that mean suddenly you're in bad standing because Karen clicked on the wrong thing? We have no idea. Like, how do you climb back up that mountain from the trough of bad standing to the peak of good standing? It doesn't actually articulate that. Is there going to be some fee for registration? Is this, really just some sort of cash grab per se from the state of Louisiana? They just need funding. And so they were like, hey, MSPs, that's a growth arena. Let's start there. Right? Why are you registering an address for being processed? I've hit upon that numerous times here, but I would really personally want to know, what are the potential negative ramifications that can come from this? Is this something where, the Secretary of State and various governmental bodies, after a public entity falls victim to a breach or ransomware, where now they're going to subpoena a ton of records for you guys? If that's true, then obviously, an MSP is going to need to look a little deeper into what are their document retention policies. Are they adhering to those policies? Do you have that policy to begin with? What are the fines and penalties? Is that even insurable? I don't know. That's a really good question. We don't have enough information yet to really even make an educated guess on that. Let's see. And, with the Secretary of State that's supposed to be promulgating all of these rules and regulations to implement this law, I mean, the government is just terrible at technology, just god awful. And I know if you're watching this, you probably saw at least a few clips of some congressional testimony for Google or Facebook or Amazon testifying in front of Congress, and it was just laughably bad how terrible those congressmen's questions were. I mean, it was almost embarrassing for the country in that regard. And then finally, you have to think, okay, let's say you're not in Louisiana, or you are and you're not going to be working in this public sector. Why would you even care about this? Well, right there at the bottom, you'll see the California breach notification law. What does that have to do with this? Well, California was the first state to enact a breach notification law, and they were kind of, the poster child, the beginning, as it were, for every other state and territory to then slap on their own particular requirements. And then it became this giant morass of breach notification laws where everyone is different and every state has them and every territory has them. And now there's international laws. So it'll be interesting to see if other states are looking at this particular piece of legislation and if they're going to start adopting this, whether it's a funding requirement, whether they have, call me a cynic, but some legitimate goodwill where they feel there's a need to actually register and somehow police MSPs and MSSPs. Should MSPs and MSSPs even be policed, or should there be some sort of legislation that actually mandates how they operate? Generally, my inner libertarian here is, against that type of oversight, but I understand that there are some bad MSPs and bad MSSPs out there that probably need to get slapped down and investigated, but maybe there's other mechanisms to do that. So how is this going to all evolve? I have no idea. I would just say that every MSP needs to keep close tabs on this, because this very well could just be that first shot across the bow. This law is potentially much more dangerous and much more serious, I think, than a lot of organizations are really giving it credit for. With that, that's all I've got for you. If you like this, like, share, comment, subscribe, share with your buddies, keep them out of trouble. And with that, stay safe.